And since there is plenty to go through in this session, I might get going with the formalities now, and people will undoubtedly keep rolling in over the next few minutes. So hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming along to this session. My name's Martin Bush. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of the Replicats team here at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also current secretary of AIMOS for another 26.5 hours, as I was just discussing with Jason. Welcome to the panel, Science Communication and Evidence-Based Policy in the Age of Metascience. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am seated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and indeed that's where this virtual conference is being hosted from. Speakers that we have today come from Ngunnawal country, Gadigal country, and from further afield. Like to use these acknowledgements of country as an opportunity for everyone to reflect on what's important. And for me, I think about how around the world, the stories of Indigenous people knowing and country is both ancient and continuing. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend a special welcome to any Indigenous colleagues who may be with us today. So we've got a great session, panel discussion coming up, discussing the sometimes tricky relationship between metascience and science communication and evidence-based policy. I think as a community, we're all committed to the idea that we need to examine scientific evidence critically, that we make sure that we don't give things a free pass, and that we look to see where science and scientific evidence can be improved. But at the same time, I think we also would all be committed to making sure that our public discussions and our public policy are in fact informed by the best standards of scientific evidence that we have available at any given time. And of course, we all know that there's been problems within this past where various science denial groups have jumped on scientific reform ideas to try and discredit science entirely, and conversely, where established scientists try to use this process to say, well, we can't air any of this meta-science stuff in public. You know, we can't air our dirty laundry because we're just going to give ammunition to our enemies. So how do we advance this? Sorry for knocking my computer with waving hands at the screen. How do we advance this particular conversation? And on these kinds of topics, we've got three speakers today. In speaking order, we've got Jonathan Y, Joan Leach, and Jason Chin. I will introduce each of them separately in more detail. And just as a note that people are probably getting used to the format of these sessions now, but this is a panel discussion. So at this stage, we're not planning any breakout rooms. We will have 3 by approximately 15 minutes presentations from our speakers, and the rest of the session will be devoted to a collective question and discussion time. So over to our first speaker, Jonathan Wise, speaking to us on scientific communication and evidence-based policy in the age of metascience, communication and education challenges. Jonathan is an assistant professor of education, policy and psychology and 21st century chair in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology. He's previously held positions at Duke University and Case Western Reserve University, and earned his PhD from Vanderbilt University. Broadly, Jonathan studies education policy through the lens of psychology, and I'll hand over to you now, Jonathan. Can everyone, collective discussion time until we've heard from all of the speakers, but by all means, if you have specific questions of clarifications or requests for references or something like that, feel free to drop them into the chat, and that might be an efficient way of doing that. Just to note that the remainder of this session will be recorded, so if you don't want to appear on the recording, please do keep your cameras off and do use the chat for any questions that you have either going along or at the end, and we can deal with them that way. So moving on to our next speaker is Joan Leach, presenting to us on why bother, 3 reasons to engage publics in metascience issues. Joan is the director of the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. Her research is centred on social epistemology, that is how knowledge travels across science and society. Science communication and public engagement with science. Joan's work's been instrumental in pushing the field of science communication to critical public engagement with science and to create forums where this engagement can meaningfully happen while remaining focused on the positive impacts of science. And I won't describe all of the positions that she's held, the grants that she's received, or the publications that she's produced, as that would take most of her 15 minutes. But recent books include An Ethics of Science Communication, co-authored with Fabian Medvicki, and the co-edited volume of Science Communication, A Global Perspective. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Martin. And wow, thank you for inviting me on this panel. I just really, really enjoyed Jonathan's paper, and maybe I would like to, throw mine over my shoulder and just talk about his now. But I will throw a few more ideas into the mix, and then maybe we can try to come to some kind of synthesis after Jason's spoken. So really, really looking forward to this. Thanks again. Okay, I'm going to do that thing where I try to share my screen, and let's just hope all goes well. Hey, did it work? Martin, give me a thumbs up. All right, very pleasing. Okay, that's me, which you already know. So I took a little bit of a different tack with this one. I love how Jonathan says that, he positioned himself as a science communicator, looking at the way in which evidence is working in policy areas. Really super interesting. I'm positioned a little different. I'm a kind of person who studies science communication, so it's already a little bit of a meta activity. And so I took this opportunity to actually ask myself a few questions about the relationship between metascience and science communication and the public, that wonderful diagram that we just saw, and to ask, why should we bother? And I think I've convinced myself of at least 2 strong reasons, and then I've got one that I'm going to throw out that I'm not sure I believe, but I'd love to discuss with you. So why should we bother? Why should we bother with communicating metascience to the public? And what does it have to do with something that I call science communication? Well, 3 simple reasons. One, publics are already engaged already, and Jonathan started to make that point. I'll kind of flesh that out. Second, we want better science communication. So I'm a consumer of a lot of the psychology literature that Jonathan just alluded to. And we rely on it in science communication to kind of understand the way that audiences are going to engage with certain ways of communicating. And I would like some of that research to be better. Okay, I would like my research to be better, and I would like some of that work coming out of social psychology to be better. And I'll give a couple of examples of how the so-called crisis is kind of impacting science communication, and maybe invite people to collaborate a little bit on a project they have in mind. And third, we want better science. So I believe that actually inviting people into science, that is public engagement with science, will actually help the scientific enterprise. Now, there's all kinds of reasons for that we can discuss, whether you have a kind of view of strong objectivity or other views. I think there's some evidence for this, but we want better science. So these are the 3 reasons, and I'm going to see if I can just kind of flesh out where I think we are in the state of play in relation to science communication with making the case for this. So publics engaged already. What is going on? Okay, so look, the last 2 years has shown us how publics can quickly become engaged in things of a scientific nature that impact them. And so the swiftness with which terms like "are not," terms like efficacy became popular, a lingua franca, a public lingua franca, was pretty amazing, actually. And at the moment, we're trying to start to assess how it was that communication, for example, around COVID, had impact on publics, okay? So there's about 3 or 4 articles a day that are coming out trying to assess that impact. So I'm just going to pick out one little area that might be of interest to people in meta science and kind of flesh out what I mean about publics already being engaged. So uncertainty is one of those meta-scientific topics that's been around, been highly contested for a long time. We've debated it around climate and climate change, what uncertainty meant in that debate, and it's come up again in relation to COVID. And so by uncertainty, I don't mean what are we going to do about COVID, the Omicron strain tomorrow, although I think we're all a little bit exercised about that. What I mean is something like what scientists mean when they talk about uncertainty. That is variation around a measured value. Now, this became quite publicly available when we started to talk about efficacy, because there was a lot of uncertainty, still is, around the efficacy of the vaccines. It's a classic uncertainty, right? Are they 78% effective? Are they 79% effective? Under what conditions? This was a very public kind of discussion. And so it was a real opportunity, I think, and I think we sort of half took it, in opening up what uncertainty is, what efficacy is, what some of these big ideas in the vaccine development and in science are. And it was also an opportunity for us to explore equivocation on uncertainty. Uncertainty meaning a measurement, or uncertainty meaning like, I'm really anxious about what's going to happen next. And the relation or not relationship between those two things. So real opportunity, and we're starting to see research now coming out. I've got one here, communicating on scientific uncertainty in the early days of COVID in Canada. You can see this around the globe. We're starting to look at media that came out in various nations and what impact that actually had on audiences. This is a fabulous opportunity for us to do some meta-analysis on this topic. It's not yet been done, but I'm telling you, there's just such a wealth of information here. So if we just take uncertainty as one example, there's an opportunity here for us to understand the way in which publics are already engaged in these questions. Maybe we got it right, maybe we didn't, in the way in which we communicated this, and how can we make it better? I think there's a wealth of evidence coming out. Now, the second wealth of evidence coming out is, what do people do with uncertainty information, right? I mean, okay, so, you know, I'll leave the vaccine hesitancy debates aside, and instead go to something kind of interesting. There's a series of papers coming out about the way in which people interpreted uncertainty in relation to how they started spending their money. Okay, so sovereign yield curves, the wealth markets, how money started to circulate around the globe in relation to various claims about what was going to happen next. Again, that equivocation and uncertainty. But this is like the largest scale willingness to pay study we've ever seen. Okay, and so this kind of research is coming out, and it's giving us a little bit of insight into what people do with this kind of uncertainty. And finally, this is some research that's been done by a PhD student at CPAS, looking at what a better understanding of uncertainty, well, better in terms of understanding it like scientists would about variation around a measured value. Does that do anything to help people understand misinformation? Well, yes, it does. Okay, so we've got a little bit of evidence about that. So here's just one example where we can see publics are already engaged in this discussion, even around something as esoteric around as uncertainty. There's a lot of unpacking, a lot of parsing, a lot of equivocation that has to be worked through, but we're getting a lot of evidence in. It's just a little bit all over the place. So I think that this is an excellent opportunity for a bit of collaboration on understanding the ways in which publics are engaged already in metascience issues. Instead of lamenting that they're absent from the field, let's see the way in which they're already engaged. So, switching gears, why else would we want to communicate meta science better? Well, look, the holy grail for me is better science communication, right? More people engaged in science, scientists who feel like their results, their work get a good hearing amongst policymakers, amongst general publics. That's kind of the holy grail. Now, my issue is, and this is where I'm saying I'm coming from a little different I'm coming from the position of a consumer. The idea that evidence should inform how we communicate science, it just holds intuitive value, right? The problem is, despite now probably a good 10, 15 years of work in what's been called the science of science communication. That is, that we're going to get data about how X was communicated, and then once we have that data, that's going to tell us how to communicate it better. We're not so great off. This has not been a raging success. Now, I'm not sure exactly why. I'd like to do a little bit more thinking about that, but let me give you two examples that, that we've been currently thinking about in our work in the center. So backlash effects, okay? So both of these concepts I'm going to talk about kind of come from economic social psychology, right? And they've really framed the way that a lot of communicators think about their science communication. So backlash effects, I'm roughly talking to that volume of research that talks about who tells you something matters, okay? So we've done some research, which was very discouraging, about if it's a female scientist communicating something, you can expect, comments. So for example, on YouTube videos of females communicating science, you can expect, a certain percentage of misogynist commentary, talk about appearance rather than what people are saying. So these are the kinds of backlash effects. Now, the problem with this is when you go to the social psychology literature, it doesn't help you predict how you should handle these things, right? So we have all this data, but it just doesn't get us anywhere. It's incredibly frustrating. So what do I do as a female who might like to communicate science and not be the recipient of misogynistic commentary? Should I communicate differently? Should I keep doing what I'm doing? There's a sense in which the literature doesn't kind of help us answer that question. Then there's a different kind of set of matters where, and this kind of links to the replication crisis, where we've got a lot of studies in social psychology that have informed science communication practice that are actually now under question. So I'm thinking about the debates over loss aversion, right, which has framed almost a generation of risk communication. The notion that you should frame risks in terms of balancing potential gains and losses, and that people are going to be more sensitive to what they lose, has informed a generation of risk communicators. And now we're reconsidering that and thinking, oh, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't how we should think about it, or not in every context. So as a consumer of a lot of this research, science communication actually has a lot at stake. And so I think the meta-science issues are absolutely critical from that perspective. I don't know if we'll ever get the Holy Grail, but I think it's worth working toward. Now, finally, better science communication through public engagement with a meta-science lens. How do we make science better? This is a project I'm just kicking off with Rachel Ankeny at Adelaide. And this is a project that has to assume that better science communication, and what we mean by that in this case is an exploration of open science and commons approaches to science communication, will lead to better scientific outcomes. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at stem cell information. And in the stem cell community, there's a need for researchers to have very good quality access to information about various stem cell lines. Turns out that a lot of advocacy communities would like access to that information as well. Now, the big question is, can you design a commons that will appeal to both of these groups and be useful? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is yet. Ask me in 2 years, but I hope so. And I also hope that some of these design solutions can then result in better knowledge practices and open scrutiny of different kinds of forms of science. So this is an example where I think thinking about science communication more broadly, bringing it researcher to researcher communication and more open communication, bringing them together instead of segmenting them like we usually do, might actually yield some knowledge gains. That's the hope. So, oh, I don't know why I did that. Sorry about that. Last slide. So, for me, what are the problems of public engagement from a meta-science perspective? Well, there's some interesting debates in the meta-science community. There are some people who think that the public is kind of irrelevant, that this is really about researcher to researcher communication. And I can see why that, even in the commons approach I just described, I can see why that kind of holds some water, that we actually have to sort out communication within science before we start talking about public engagement. However, there's also a group of people who see open science as really open science, inviting everyone in. I think that's a really, it's a lovely essential tension, and it's worth exploring further. Second, as I mentioned, I think science communication itself suffers an evidence problem, and we've been looking to various forms of the science or social sciences to help us answer some of that evidence problem. And I think we're getting discouraged. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But there's a slight retreat to a kind of an art of communication approach, saying, well, look, you know, practitioners get a knack for this. Some people are better writers than others, you know, and not relying so much on evidence because that evidence seems like it's been a bit lacking or dubious. And finally, you know, lessons from metascience, you know, just cause confusion for those outside science. So this uncertainty stuff, there's too much equivocation. Okay, let's just educate people and clarify. And sort of not confuse people with our metascientific problems, versus taking this moment as an opportunity, which I hope I kind of made the argument for in the first case, an opportunity to look at the way in which publics are already engaged in a set of arguments that can open up science to discussion and scrutiny, and to have a good conversation about it. So I think we're at a moment, I mean, for me, from my position in science communication, there's this like Janus face of meta style problems. And I'm not really sure what the answer is, but I think these tensions are absolutely useful and kind of really, I think they might position science communication in a better place going forward. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. And again, join me in thanking Joan. There's so much to think about there, and I'm not sure that our question time is going to be able to deal with everything. Jennifer Burns just dropped into chat a link to a recording of Christine Wells and Rachel Ankeny speaking about the stem cell commons that Joan mentioned. So thanks, Jennifer, and please do continue using chat for things like that. So we'll move on to our third speaker, Jason Chin, speaking on meta-research and scientific communication in legal contexts. Jason is lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Sydney. Prior to this position, he obtained a PhD from the University of British Columbia and a JD from the University of Toronto. Practiced as a litigator in Toronto. Jason studies the use of research and evidence in courts and amongst law reform bodies, especially interested in using insights from meta-research to ensure that the legal system relies on credible research. And Jason, of course, is the current president of AIMOS. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks. Are you seeing that okay, Martin?
Yep, seeing
awesome.
It fine. Yep.
And yeah, thanks, John and Joan. I've always thought that like a lot of my research is about scientific communication, but we rarely engage with that field, and I don't know the frameworks and terminologies to kind of ground this. So it was very, very helpful and enlightening. Although, you know, as Joan said, maybe the Holy Grail. So I often say maybe we should be engaging with science communication more. But if the Holy Grail isn't there yet, or if it is a Holy Grail, maybe that isn't so bad after all. I don't feel quite as guilty. Yeah, so a lot of what I try to do and think about is how to more responsibly or accurately or effectively communicate science to lay people, in particular judges, juries, policymakers, and lawmakers. And I think some of the challenges that were just mentioned are present. You know, this various, I think John used the term discipline myopia, but more generally, you know, there's a real information asymmetry in that the scientist who's communicating to those legal decision makers knows more naturally than they do about the topic. And as Joan mentioned, there's this challenge in communicating uncertainty or error, possibility of error, and doing that responsibly. I think there's some additional challenges in the work that I do and think about, which is, especially when if it's a expert witness in some sort of legal dispute, it's going to be adversarial. So the expert witness is being typically paid for as having their retainer paid by one side. So there's that extra got a motivation, that extra bias. There also might be a professional bias. So if you're someone who works for the police or a forensic scientist, you wouldn't want to say your field is bad. So you kind of have that additional source of bias. And perhaps what I call noble cause distortion. So you feel like you're on the side of right. So you might be extra motivated to not disclose the uncertainty that you should perhaps. I think all of this is, the guy I have on this is, if you've watched the show, this documentary called The Staircase, there is this expert witness named Dwayne Deaver, who's purportedly a blood spatter expert and kind of fell prey to, I think, all of these things, and did a lot of things that I think like a meta scientist or meta researcher would call like p-hacking or questionable research practices, more or less. Also, probably fraud as well. So it's all parts of the spectrum there. But the case was about if the accused, I think Michael Peterson's wife, had fallen down the staircase accidentally, or she was pushed, and there's a whole bunch of the interpretations of that which were innocent, that it was an accidental fall. But he pretty much only disclosed these videos that he made of how that fall could have happened in a way that was criminal. So some sort of reporting bias there. And yeah, the two contexts I look at this in, already mindful of time, so I might just get to the first one, even though I originally wanted to talk more about the second, is the adjudication of some sort of legal disputes, and then actually creating law and policy. So with the first, I think one of the most serious stakes in this is that if you get it wrong, if the scientific communication doesn't happen effectively, someone quite seriously can be convicted of a crime that they didn't commit. So there's pretty good evidence for this from this, probably the largest databases in the US of the Innocence Project, looking at the first 325 cases in which someone was exonerated based on DNA evidence. So quite strong evidence that they were factually innocent. And in about 50% of those cases, you see from the yellow bar, it's hard to say what caused the wrongful conviction, right? But we know that in 50% of those cases, there was some sort of forensic science that wasn't validated yet, so it wasn't known if it worked or it was improper. And perhaps a bit more in a more subtle way, this is a report from President Obama's scientific advisors in 2016. They say, in addition to these problems with the lack of reliable methods, reviews have found that expert witnesses often overstate the probative value of their evidence, going beyond what the science can justify. So even if the practice does work, they say it works better than it actually does. Which I also sort of ascribe to a problem with scientific communication. And yeah, as John mentioned, how does this fit together with meta research and law? So two questions I've been pondering is what can meta research tell us about this problem that we don't just know intuitively, and what perhaps insights does it have in terms of solutions? And the first thing that I would note is that this is not a new topic of meta research. Meta research itself is not new at all. I think it's been around since science itself started, or research itself started. But sociologists of science, field of STS, would have, since at least 1992, written articles about this. This is Sheila Jasanoff saying what judges should know about the sociology of science. And more or less the message is that you should understand that science and scientific communities are people, and they're error prone, and they have the same motivations that all of us do. And Simon Cole, also something of an STS scholar, in '98 wrote this article where he uses the term meta expertise, which is, I think, really interesting to think about. And it sort of reflects on his own experience as a witness for the defense in many of these cases. He's not a fingerprint expert. He doesn't know how to do a fingerprint analysis, but he is an expert on their expertise. So he'll come in and say, this is a field that hasn't really done much testing on themselves. This is a field where the tests that do exist show a substantially higher error rate than you might expect. So yeah, he's even using that term meta to refer to expertise. He's an expert on experts. So that makes me kind of self-conscious, and I try to figure out, is what I'm doing, what is it adding to this that hasn't already been said? I'll just give you a little example. So I think one thing that Metaresearch does relatively well is to integrate some traditions from previous research, maybe not as well as it should, but some of the more recent wave of meta-research is using techniques from scientometrics, journalology, looking at academic scientific journal author guidelines and requirements. And so one thing that I did was in this paper, Open Forensic Science, was I looked at, I think, all of the forensic science journals that I could find and looked at their author guidelines, the idea being that if they're encouraging forensic scientists who are doing this foundational research to share their data, register their studies, then that's probably a good sign for this field, and which suggests that researchers in this area can scrutinize each other's data, can find potential flaws, correct errors. It's perhaps a credible field. I found the exact opposite. There's a standard of reporting guidelines in journals called the Transparency and Openness Guidelines, I think started by the Center for Open Science and various other groups. You can get a 0 through 3, 3 being the highest level of disclosure. And not one journal had anything above a 0. Some would encourage open data, things like that, but they wouldn't require it or require even a statement about it. So does this really add anything to what Simon Cole's been saying for years? I mean, I kind of think it does. Maybe that's a bit self-serving, but I think it's nice that we sort of borrowing from these various traditions within meta-research can now have a metric that we can use, and we can revisit this metric and see if the field is improving over time, if the field is regulating itself a bit more. Now, would this add anything to Simon Cole's testimony, where he would come in to the court and tell the jury that, look, fingerprint examiners, forensic scientists, they don't really regulate themselves. It's not a very robust field. Would it help if he added this little tidbit in there? I don't know. I'd be curious what John and Joan think. It might just be too esoteric. Another thing I think Metaresearch does pretty well is, maybe at least more than some other fields, is interdisciplinarity. So I think one of the great products out of the Metaresearch, the last 10 years of Metaresearch, is taking prospective registration from medicine and bringing that to the social sciences. I think there's been some real demonstrable benefits to that. And since BEM and since the reproducibility project psychology, we've seen a huge increase in registrations on the open science framework, and we've seen a lot more journals accepting registered reports than we used to. I think that's great, and we quite good evidence that it works. So can we use that knowledge that stand-in reports tend to exaggerate an effect and registered reports seem to show a more realistic picture? Does that tell us anything about forensic science that we didn't already know? This is a bit of an information-laden chart, but the general idea is this is a summary of the false positive rate from various studies of fingerprint analysis. And one message from that is that the earliest studies are in 2009, which is very troubling since fingerprint analysis has been used to convict people for about a century. So that's troubling. And the other message is that there is a non-trivial false positive rate. But I think we could also look at this and say not a single one of these was pre-registered. Not a single one was conducted as a registered report. And they're almost all of them, except the Tangen ones, I think, are conducted by the forensic scientists themselves. So we sort of kind of question that as we would a study conducted by a drug manufacturer, right? So does what we know about this inform how we maybe should go forward and how we should treat previous research? I think so, and wrote this article encouraging forensic science journals to start accepting registered reports. I started a letter writing campaign. I got about 50 forensic scientists to sign it. And finally, one journal is going to start accepting registered reports in forensic science next year with me as the editor. So I think that might be a tangible new thing that Metaresearch has added to it. I'm going to kind of speed through the rest. I think I can get through the rest, but I'm going to go a bit fast, but happy to pick up on any of this stuff during the discussion. So one thing as part of this kind of move towards interdisciplinarity, we're learning that reporting guidelines, at least in some journals, work pretty well. They get the authors to report if they've switched the outcome, things that would kind of cast doubt in their study that's kind of negative for, it makes their study less convincing. They'll actually report these things a little bit more if they're forced to follow the concert reporting guidelines. And can we use something like that for forensic scientists to get them to disclose potential flaws with their research? I proposed this. It hasn't really gone anywhere, but I thought that might be a good idea. And in the last minute and a half, this is what I kind of meant to do the whole talk on, is my more recent stuff has been on law and policymaking. So here in Australia, there's quite influential bodies called law reform commissions, which do research and recommend changes to the law to the governments, and they're usually taken up. I think at least half of the time they're taken up, which is pretty influential. And quite interestingly, if you go through their websites and through their reports, they will almost always say, and I forget, one of the speakers said this only happens about 10% of the time in reality, but they'll say that we're data driven, right? The value of reliable data is cannot be understated when making law and policy. And if you look at their websites, they say we're obsessed with transparency. Like we make everything transparent. Everything we do is transparent. All of our discussions, all of our reports are transparent, but they don't really seem to connect these. So there's someone named Bree Lee who criticized one report, saying that, or she was quoting another group that said this report completely overlooked a huge body of peer-reviewed research. And it's true. Like if you actually look in these reports, they don't have any processes in there that you would have in a transparent systematic review, which would force them to disclose that, yeah, we looked at this, but we didn't think it was important, or we assign less weight to this study over this study. They just kind of cite whatever they want to cite, and arguably stuff that supports their work. And this has been a longstanding critique, but using kind of a meta-research technique, Shinichi Nakagawa and Losha Lagic, and I looked at all the systematic reviews that were commissioned by the Royal Commission into institutional child sexual assault. This was a huge Royal Commission. I think the overall cost was 500 million, and they commissioned lots of really beautiful reports. But we took a look at the system, which purported to be systematic reviews. Only 4 of them followed a reporting guideline. Only 2 were registered, and only about half actually said how they excluded studies in those systematic reviews. So it's kind of troubling. Over time, so I'll just say, my thoughts on this are, well, again, I kind of want that holy grail that Joan was talking about. But I do think meta-research has something to say about how to get experts and people engaging with law reform to communicate more fully and transparently. Again, if that would actually be taken up, it's another question, through things like registration and reporting guidelines. And we have this, I think, a little bit more nuanced data now about expertise and expert evidence, but how to actually communicate that to a lay decision maker. You can, as I mentioned, like Simon Cole would say, this is a field that shouldn't be trusted. It's not regulating itself. Is my added data point going to be valuable to tell a jury, or would that go over their head? I really don't know. I'm very curious, and I would like to test that one day or something. Anyway, thanks. My slides are on the open science framework.
Right. Thank you, Jason. And thanks to all the speakers for being very timely. So we've now got half an hour for collective discussion and questions. So feel free to drop things into chat. There's a number of comments in chat already that we can come back to, or use the raise hand facility on the participants pane if you want to ask a question. And I might just, you know, sort of take the chair's prerogative of opening up with a question. I do have a question that's kind of a bit of a hybrid question for Jonathan and Joan. And Jonathan, I was sort of, you know, I was taken by your call for science communication to really aim to look at the body of evidence on any particular question and not just pick studies. And I sort of lined that up against, you know, sort of Joan's point that publics are already engaged. And so I sort of see that there's two potential points of failure here. First of all, there's that, you know, that's a difficult thing to do, and some science communicators are better or worse at it, the kind of art of science communication that Joan talked about. But the second question, the second point of failure is that whether that kind of the models of media and stories that are coming out are actually well suited to meet the engagement needs of publics at the moment, whether just sort of the, you know, individual stories being thrown out, whether that's the way to go. So my question is, to what extent do you think there's those two points of failure in getting to the getting to communicate that body of evidence? So, you know, Jonathan and Joan, I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on that. Jonathan, you're still, yeah. I'm still not hearing Jonathan. Sorry, you might have an audio issue there with your headphones. Or... No. Oh, well, maybe I'll throw to Joan on that question first, and John, maybe
that's
just
too bad. I was actually interested in what Jonathan was going to say.
Oh, wow. We might need a moment.
Thanks for that question, Martin. It's really good. So back to your points of failure, audiences already being engaged. Ask the last bit again.
You know, sort of to what extent is it just a problem that it's a difficult thing for journalists to do? To what extent is this the media model of, you know, sort of individual stories that we pitch rather than kind of engaged ongoing conversations where, you know, sort of possibly there's a point of failure?
Look, I'm not going to blame, there's a lot of blaming of journalists that goes on. I don't tend to be in that camp. I think actually the problem's much bigger, and that's about a sense that a lot of science communication is push, right? People telling other people what, you know, researchers telling publics what they think publics should know. And that's the problem, right? And if you can flip any of that so that it's actually public saying, oh my gosh, I'm really concerned about this. And then you have people kind of crowdsourcing excellent evidence and presenting it to them through journalism, through whatever, through social media or whatever else, you have a very different dynamic. Now, what's interesting to me is, you know, about the era we've just lived through is COVID showed how people did demand a certain kind of information. There was a flight to quality, back to, you know, relatively well-resourced media outlets that were putting out really good information. People went back to that in large numbers. So look, I mean, I think the problem is bigger than journalists and individual stories. The problem is that most of the individual stories are about breakthroughs that nobody wants to know about. They're not talking about what the conversations that people want to have about science. So, I mean, you know, I think there's a real opportunity for those people who are working in areas. And that's the other thing is, you know, there's a lot of science that, you know, it's not made for prime time. And I think that has to be okay. But if metascience can kind of curate some of these issues that people want to know about, if we know what those are, I have some ideas, but others may as well, then I think you got a really a good opportunity. It's not just the push of individual researchers wanting to get their research out there. Yeah.
Great, and Jonathan's rejoined us, so just check your audio again and No, we're still not hearing you. There's some audio settings gone wrong there with your setup. Still nothing. If you, of course, it's not nearly going to be good enough, but if you can't work out that audio, maybe there's, you can also drop any thoughts into chat. But yeah, Fiona asking how fast you can type. Oh, well, there you go. Challenge accepted. So meanwhile, so you know, I'll come back to some of the earlier comments in chat, but just maybe.
I was going to follow up on something that Joan just said. I was kind of curious, Joan, do you think that, I guess John as well, that the people who are consuming the media expect more data than they used to, or expect like the Moneyball era where we're less convinced by like skilled artisans and we're more demanding of data? Is there any data on that?
I don't think there's data on that. Although, let me flip the question. What about your expectations, right? I mean, so it's really interesting. I mean, if you take yourself out of, you know, our usual academic context and put us in other contexts where we're consumers of scientific or medical health stuff, you know, it's 3 a.m. and your kid has a fever and you want to know how much, you know, ibuprofen or whatever to give them. And you're on the Mayo Clinic website and you know, what kind of information do you expect? Now, there are some really interesting studies that look at, you know, behavior in those contexts, but not so much about expectation of evidence. At a glance, I would say, I mean, this is hunch. I think people do have a much more of an expectation. If it's not coming with a percentage or something next to it, then it might just not seem kosher, not scientific enough. But these are proxies, right? These are proxies for evidence, maybe not the evidence themselves. But I would guess they are. But I mean, but I think we need to ask ourselves that question as consumers as well, what we expect. You know what I mean? I think because we're part of the public.
Yeah.
I might throw Fiona's question for Jason straight to Jason now. So Fiona's interested in the question of how well calibrated experts from different fields might be, also relevant to working expert forecasting. Haven't seen anything very compelling emerge from that. Have you or anyone else looked into that area and found anything useful?
Fiona, we were talking, you and I were talking about this, I think, a related issue a while ago, and I'd like to restart that at some point, but at least because I know you and Martin as well and Bonnie study like the best way to get judgments from experts in the most sort of nuanced and calibrated way, and you know, I think the current system, if you have an expert witness where they're just kind of being cross-examined and examined, I'm not quite sure that's the best way to get information out of them. In the same way that like law reform bodies will have these sessions, like roundtables that are recorded, where they'll just kind of have people go around and kind of give their opinion. And I'm not really sure that is also the best way to get those expert judgments out. I know there are actually, you know, evidence-based ways of doing that I would really like to see brought into law and policy. And I think some like science and health policy is driven that way, but more generally. And Jennifer Doliak has a website where she and her colleague Anna Harvey have on various like criminological issues, they've sort of polled experts and they have their kind of like real-time average of like the expert consensus on a certain criminological topic, which is pretty cool. That's all I know about.
Great. Austin Mackles just posted a link to some research on that question of expectations of evidence in journalism, which we were discussing before, so thanks very much. I might just, you know, sort of, I will go back to the first things raised in chat, and that was Adrian Barnett asking whether, you know, sort of we missed the sweet spot in terms of studying, you know, sort of responses to COVID, that it started off, sort of too hot to have a thoughtful conversation, and now people are exhausted. And Joan, you did put some, sort of thoughts in that, but did you have anything that you wanted to, sort of expand further on that?
No, I mean, I think Adrian's absolutely right. I mean, it was kind of, at the beginning, everybody was like, oh, well, this is great. This is like, research in real time. And there were all these research groups got together trying to figure out what's going on. And it was really interesting how that kind of ground us all down, really. But on the positive side, I mean, I do think, the studies coming out every day at the moment are now an opportunity for us to pause, take a breath, and actually design some way of kind of talking about the evidence that's coming out about what we saw. And some of that's going to be about media reports. It's going to be about consumption habits. It's going to be all that stuff. I just think it's an excellent opportunity. So I actually think in terms of a flashback and thinking, wow, what just happened? I think we're still in the sweet spot. For gathering data about how publics are interacting, I think Adrian's right. We are all absolutely exhausted, but now we've got an opportunity to say, okay, when a culture is exhausted, what do they care about, right? What becomes important when you're looking at a bit of political upheaval, you're looking at a bit of, there's, describe the world we're in, what becomes important in that moment? And so I think there's a sweet spot for that kind of work. And we may be in this part, which I don't think is a sweet spot, because now we got to deal with, climate crisis and catastrophe and everything else. So what is important to publics when you're under duress, when we've got a social fabric that is fraying? I think that would be the question to start asking now.
Thanks, and maybe moving on to Jennifer Burns' broad question for all panelists. Could the panel discuss evidence about how to effectively increase the science literacy of the general public? So again, Jonathan, you might have to sort of put your thoughts on that question into chat, but I'll throw to Jason and Joan to answer directly. Thoughts on general science literacy and sort of to what extent is that a problem, and do you know good evidence on that question?
I don't want to become one of the experts that I criticize, or I'm not, who speak outside of their area of expertise. So I don't really know very much about that. The things I've been thinking about are there really isn't a culture, or there really don't exist any great systematic reviews in forensic science. And I would think that that would be something you could present to a judge or jury as if you had one that was quite high quality, saying, look, this is what is known, this is what's not known. And regardless of their level of scientific literacy, I would think that would just be a great neutral way to assist them. The same way, I mean, we have these really excellent Cochrane and Campbell systematic reviews in absolutely critical areas, but in this area that affects people's liberty, we don't have them, and it seems like a sort of a no-brainer to create them.
Joan, you have thoughts on that issue?
On science literacy? Oh gosh. So look, I mean, okay. It's important that we have a lot of, I think, effort spent on all kinds of literacy efforts when we're talking about school, right? Because that's part of what we do in an education context, is we assess people's literacy. After people leave formal schooling, I think it makes a lot less sense to start talking about that in that way, because that's not the point of living, right? At that point, we're engaging in a world for different purposes. And so I get really concerned when there's a kind of assumption around people have to know this much to be able to engage in a topic. I get a little bit concerned about that, because the evidence that I know of, and I wish Jonathan could talk, because he's an education, he works in the education space. But the evidence I see is that actually it's by engaging that people learn. So asking people to have a certain level of literacy before they engage in a topic is actually asking them not to engage. And so I actually think that a lot of learning comes in the mix. And so I kind of try not to talk about in terms of literacy, because I see that as a barrier to engagement and not actually an enabler of engagement.
Thanks, Joan. That's fantastic. And can I, you know, as an erstwhile science communication scholar, congratulate you on getting all the way through that answer without once using the term deficit model.
And to that Pew survey, that Jonathan put up, I think is quite helpful. And I think it's the same one where the public said that they tend to trust open research more than research that's not conducted transparently, which epistemically fits with what a lot of meta researchers think.
Pranali's got a question to ask us directly. Pranali, do you want to?
Yes. Yeah. Hi. So I wanted to ask, like, I think like what Joan said right now, that we don't need like literacy up to a certain level, but I think, you know, having the sort of tools for critical thinking is something you do need sometimes. So more than a question, I just wanted to see if this idea makes sense, that I like in India, we like what we have seen with social media, there's a lot of political polarization, false information, and so on. So like I'm from India, and I know of like 2 YouTube channels which actually taught critical thinking in their channels before presenting like 2 different sides of news, because most of the media here is, you know, with one perspective. So they actually looked at like they did experiments to sort of debunk some of the, you know, crazy WhatsApp forwards which happen in India and so on. So it's actually in Hindi, it's for, you know, all lay public, and they became actually quite popular. So, you know, they sort of gave it in a very, I don't know, informal way. So in the same sense, I was thinking like, it's not that they don't need to know a lot, but like some basic things like confirmation bias or the way arguments are put forward to you and stuff like this. So even with just that, maybe it's okay, like it's good enough to explain them more detailed things, you know, if they understand this part. I don't know, I just like wanted to know what are the thoughts about this.
Any quick responses there, Joan? Or?
Well, I think that's great, and it's interesting. I mean, to collect these kinds of examples where the kind of fact checking or engaging in counter misinformation are successful, especially on social media, because they don't tend to be successful. If you want to be successful in countering misinformation on social media, you usually need to have a pretty concerted, well-funded campaign of many people, or a bot, right? I mean, it's one person, you know, the lone scientist countering misinformation on social media is not going to work. So it's great to see examples where that does work. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I'm a big fan of, in science communication, of showing and not telling. And so one of the things I think some of the best science journalism does is it builds in those kind of critical thinking aspects into its own journalism. So, you know, where you have to kind of hear multiple interpretations of one thing, and the evidence for those interpretations. You get to see scientists disagreeing in public, right? This is something that people get really afraid of. I actually think it's a fantastic thing, because what it shows is it helps people gain those critical thinking skills when they're watching and thinking, what do I think when these 2 people are slogging it out? And so I think watching science as it's made, as it's argued, so they can follow those lines of argument, I think all that is also a positive way of building critical thinking into journalism, without having to go the literacy route.
I'm just going to do a bit of a soft question here, Joan, because I just invite you.
I had a quick thing.
Oh,
sorry. Yeah. Just that thing I just dropped in the chat kind of supported that last question in a way. I don't know how. It's just one data point, but some researchers, Mahmood and colleagues, like randomly assigned some policymakers in Pakistan to read Josh Anger's book, Taking the Con Out of Econometrics, and watching some of his lectures, and found that they, after that, picked more evidence-based policies. So, which is a book about kind of like critically appraising research to some extent. So, again, I don't know if that would replicate or whatnot, but.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to, sort of invite, Joan to give a quick plug for that recent work, co-edited book, because I mean, there was another aspect of that observation and Jason's point there is, of course, understanding the cultural context in which communication occurs. And, sort of too often in the past, there has been, less attention to that in science communication studies. So a very soft invite for Joan to plug the value of that.
Yeah, well, thank you certainly for that, Martin. I will plug it, but it's free, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. It's free to download. It's called Science Communication in Global Context. And it looked at science communication practices and also policy, how governments have written science communication into policy since the Second World War. And we looked at 39 countries and territories. Found just a wide and wild variety of practices. So, and that really struck me because, that got me a little bit more concerned about the kind of stuff we teach. So I train science communicators, and that got me really concerned because the kinds of evidence base we're relying upon may not fly in the north of Australia, let alone in our region, let alone anywhere else. So, and a lot of the social psychology research that science communication is based on comes out of the US. And so it's not just weird, it's, in terms of white, educated, et cetera, it's also a very particular segment of weird, and that's American weird. So I've become more concerned rather than less after looking at this book, but have a look at the book. You can go to the ANU website, free to download. We did that on purpose because we have contributors from Africa and from the Global South, so that it's free. So have a go. Thanks, Martin.
And meanwhile, I'll just note, Jonathan is doing a absolutely sterling job typing fast into chat. So please, sort of check out the numerous links and comments that have been made there. But certainly that point about learning to write in plain language, and I think that goes to that diagram that you showed during your presentation about the need to step back and see the whole picture. That is, sort of see your field as other people see it, which can be sort of enormously difficult thing to do, but I think probably is one of those key skills of that art of science communication. Yeah. Do we have further? There was one more question in chat that I don't think we've quite got to, which was, but please, if people have remaining questions or comments, we're starting to run out of time, so please, sort of do that. But having trouble finding the question, but I think it was a question about, sort of how do we communicate scandal in, Adrian Barnett's question, how do we communicate scientific scandal to the public, e.g. the Surgisphere debacle in the Lancet? Any thoughts on that from panelists?
Adrian, give us a thumbnail on the Surgisphere debacle. I know about many debacles, and I'm just not across this one.
It was just a whole load of COVID data that, it was completely made up, and very quickly became evident, just like simple things like the number of patients they had from Australia was just impossible. So it was a real failure of peer review, although some people argue that you can't expect peer reviewers to peer review the data. But anyway, the Lancet were quite haughty about how good they were being, and it really took them down a notch. I didn't say anything about it because I was worried about undermining science, but at the same time, it was a very frustrating example of the kind of rubbish that's getting published.
While we've got you on the line, Adrian, why don't I put you on the spot and say, what would your expectations be around communication around these kinds of scandals?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, we touched on this earlier. You want to raise attention to this and say, hey, we need to fix this. But was COVID the right time to do it when everyone, it felt like people were leaning heavily on science to get us out of this. So were we white-anting that? I honestly don't.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but I mean, see, I actually think that I'm a big fan of the warts and all approach. And that's why I said about, watching scientists argue in public. because that tells us a lot about the lines of argument. And I would say like these scandals, I mean, because I teach a course on controversial science, and we look at a number of them. Now this is, case n equals 10, okay? I'm not doing a meta-analysis on these things, and it's very hard to do because each controversy is controversial in its own way. But it seems to me that when it comes out best, it's when you can actually get at what is at issue, and you can build alliances, allegiances, cohorts who care about what is at issue, and they can actually have legitimate discussions and discussions about legitimation as well. They can have those really useful discussions, and those are public discussions. I worry if cleaning up science is all about scientific autonomy and doing it when the lights are off. I don't think that's a great public message about how science actually should work and how we hope it works. It's kind of like shine a light on it. And if we got more familiar and a little bit more at ease that sometimes things go wrong, not everything would have to be a threat to the scientific enterprise, right? It's kind of like, well, yeah, things go wrong. They go wrong in every mode of inquiry, in every industry. We don't have to be afraid. I think right now we're just a little afraid, because if we shine a light, then all of a sudden, oh, well, there goes the whole scientific edifice. I actually think science is a lot stronger than that. But I think it's still very much a powerful discourse in culture. So I don't know that we should be so afraid, but that's my view. And it'd be really interesting to think of a way in which we looked at the ways that these controversies play out in terms of how publics receive them, because those reception studies, they're just not there.
Jason, anything to add on that point?
Oh, no, not. I mean, not really. I think it's the thing that I thought about was, yeah, warts and all is good, is great, but it's really hard to get just people who aren't that motivated to pay attention to see the warts or critically appraise them. It's hard enough to get scientists to do that. So I just see it as a really difficult challenge.
Yeah. So we are running out of time. We might just address Austin's comment as the last thing, and then I'll go for quick final statements from all of the panelists in reverse order, not least to give Jonathan enough time to type any closing comments. But so Austin's comment is, how much of the science communication problem, if any, is unique to science communication rather than news media more generally? People aren't accepting election results, let alone complex science. And, so I'll just comment from the chair that, I mean, that does make me, brings up that question of that, sort of old style expectations of scientists that their communications would be epistemically privileged and should be treated in different ways to other kinds of news. And possibly that is another area where meta research can really positively contribute to changing that kind of culture. But comments from Jason or Joan on that issue, and noting that Jonathan's put some responses to that in chat already as well. So please check them out. With no specific comments on that, then I might indeed ask our panelists all to give, just sort of a final, any summing up of this session as a whole. We'll go in reverse order, just one and a half minutes each. Jason?
As you've probably seen, I'm not the best at these kinds of remarks, but I don't know, I guess my takeaway personally is that I feel both like better and worse, and that it's nice to know that other people who study some form of scientific communication, or who are at the top of the field in that, are struggling with the very issues that I am struggling with, which means that I'm not completely missing something, which is a heartening feeling, but it's also worrisome in that I can't just take their methods and use their conclusions to solve my problems, which would be nice.
Final thoughts for us, Joan?
Yeah, just thank you very much for this panel. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I actually think metascience has this way of seeing, the science-society relationship or not, is actually really, really useful for science communication, because it pushes us to think about our own evidence, which as I've kind of confessed, I think a lot of it isn't perfect, or maybe even good enough in some cases. So I think that is really, really useful. And I'm actually, quite excited about rethinking some of the work we do in science communication along these lines, because I think these problems are really super important. So, so thank you.
Great, thanks, Joan. And Jonathan, you got anything final to drop into chat for us? And I just have to give an extra special thanks to in the face of technical challenges being being able to keep up such a good job there. I'm not quite sure what our plan as a conference to sort of dealing with these chat threads, but this has been a particularly rich and useful one. So I'll try and sort of make sure that the good bits of it are saved somewhere. But if everyone can now just sort of join me in thanking all of the speakers and indeed everyone who participated in this session in some way. It really has been fantastic. And otherwise we'll sign off and give you a few minutes before the next session on the program.
And thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Martin. Great sharing.
Yeah, feel free to everyone to unmute yourself briefly if you want to sing out to the panelists on your way out.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jenny. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Rose, should we switch over?